welcome to Beyond the Filter, a podcast about censorship. My name's Brandy.
And my name's Jeremy. In this episode, we'll be talking with a special guest, Aurélie Petit, who is a social and visual researcher of animation and technology and a PhD candidate in the Film Studies Department at Concordia University, Montreal. She's just published an article in the journal Porn Studies titled "The Limits of Zero Tolerance Policies for Animated Pornographic Media." Welcome to the podcast, Aurélie.
Hi, thank you for having me.
So congratulations on the article. I wanted to ask you, where does your interest in this topic come from? Are you a fan of animated media yourself?
So if we really go back, oh my God, at this point, almost 10 years ago, I was doing my master at La Sorbonne Nouvelle in Paris. And I decided to work on the reception of Japanese pornographic animation in France. So I wanted to figure out why hentai was so popular, in among the French public, because I was seeing the Pornhub special insight, and I could see that hentai was always on top. And I was like, this seems interesting. It's why does the French context seems to be really into hentai? So Japanese pornographic animation. And, I started to work on it. Of course, you start to have a lot of question of ethics that keeps on popping up, of representation of, young bodies and age, concern about age and gender. And so, I was working on this in French, and then I came to Canada to do my PhD. And, I always kept it in the back as a research. I started to work more on exclusionary online anime fandom, so all the 4chan of the world. But of course, this question of the lolicon kept on coming back. And so in the last years, I started to do more work on pornography. And, I have a chapter of my thesis that is about pornography. And so, it kind of led me to work on this and on the policies of the platforms on which this media circulates.
Yeah, well, we'll get to that, and maybe you can tell us a bit about your findings. But first, I wondered if you would relate the story that you open your article with about what happened on Twitch in 2023.
Yes, Twitch, as a response to, fans' criticism that the platform was targeting sexuality in a way they felt was unjustified, and a lot of queer people were being targeted, a lot of women, everybody who was showing too much nudity. If you could see your cleavage on Twitch, you would be considered basically doing porn. And so the platform started to really soften its policies over adult content, and especially when it was about animation, and they were saying turns out if you were drawing, sculpting, or, making animation on Twitch and you were, drawing naked people, it was fine. And in one day, so many people made porn, animated cartoon porn, that the day after, the platform decided to cancel its policies, but in one day, which is crazy for a platform like Twitch. Well, and, they justified that animation was just getting out of hand.
Well, I think that's not the only example of something like that happening. Didn't OnlyFans also turn their policies around in a couple of days or so? So, I think one of the themes of your paper is that these platforms maybe don't have very well thought through, very well developed policies on particularly animated content versus real content that depicts the same thing. So what did you discover in the platforms that you looked at? I think there were 30 platforms, right?
Yeah, so, this kind of example of Twitch, I used it to open the question of, as you say, that platforms don't know what to do with animation, and it end up having them have policies that are totally weird or don't really make sense, go against common sense. And so I was curious of, this question of how do you moderate animation, and especially how do you moderate animation on a pornographic platform that don't have to just find, sexuality and kicked out of the platform. Is for porn platforms, they actually have to be is this good sex or is it bad sex? And I was very interested in this, good porn versus bad porn, and how does animation exist? And so, but to think of those questions, first, you need to understand how those platforms talk about it. And so I decided to find 30 pornographic websites, and I took their policy documents. And, I was focusing on this question of age. So I wanted to see, when they talk about age and, child pornography, how do they include animation in this discussion?
Yeah, so I noticed it's interesting that you used the term animated child pornography, because child pornography as a term is not really used anymore, is it? We've started to move to child sexual abuse material. But speaking for myself, I always feel uncomfortable in using the word child sexual abuse material when there's no child sexual abuse, right? When there's no child. And in that way, even though child pornography is like an antiquated term, it's more appropriate in some ways, wouldn't you say, when we're talking about animated content?
As you say, like I also feel uncomfortable talking about child sexual abuse materials, and talking about child exploitation, knowing that of course it's a spectrum. Are like computer generated imagery, sometimes that is AI, where a child may be used as a model, and it's maybe part of an exploitation circle or like a traffic, But then you also have the Bart Simpson of the world, as I call them, and it's like, it's a spectrum. And what I was able to see in a lot of those policies is like, they don't make a lot of space for this spectrum, and like a very problematic, hyper realistic animated image of a child in a sexual context was, at least on paper, put at the same level as a very cartoonish representation of a child.
And I feel like animation is just fundamentally ambiguous because with live action, you've got an actor involved or a person or whatever, and they have an unambiguous age. No matter what they look like, no matter what age they're playing, they have a true age, which you can use to ultimately judge the content. But with animation, they don't have a true age. They just have whatever the creator decides however old the creator decides to say they are on that day and however old they look. And the age of the character may change on the creator's whim, and you can't really judge purely on appearance, because in reality, you can't really judge purely on appearance either. And the stylization of animation makes things even more ambiguous. A creator may have a character that they say is usually 15, but whenever they appear in pornography, they may just claim that they're 18, even though they draw them exactly the same way.
Aging up.
Yeah. That's why I'm more interested in talking about problematic representation, that are about age and gender. Like, we can have a conversation about, representing young-looking characters in pornography. And it's a better conversation that like trying to argue which age is a character. But it's like, as a community, like we can wonder, like, do we want the imagery of pornography to be mostly young looking people? Like, do we want it to be the main representation of animation, knowing that it's not always the case, but it's also often made by sexist animation studios, sexist creators. Like, it's a more interesting conversation for me.
Isn't there also a cultural history behind, particularly, as you mentioned, lolicon, shotacon? Those are particular genres that have a stylized look for their characters that isn't directly related to age, right? And I think you found only 2 of the platforms that you looked at actually used that fandom terminology to talk about particular types of content that, by those names, referring to them as shota and lolicon content. So tell us a bit more about that kind of subset, I guess, of sexual content.
Well, again, like, if we link it to this idea of problematic media representations, one of the history we have for the beginning of lolicon is that, it was a genre that kind of always existed. You can trace it back to, almost, the golden age of manga. But then it really solidified where, a group of men started to, like in Japan, started to realize that like yaoi, so like gay manga pornography, and women were taking a lot of space in the the fandoms, the conventions. Like, at least this is the story they say. As an answer, they decided to, really popularize this representation of young girls. So you kind of have this like woman exclusionary, queer exclusionary story that is very much part of it. And I think we cannot subtract it from this history. Like, when we think of those representations, it's like they were used to, go against women, go against queer representations. And they were used to be weaponized. So for me, that's kind of the history of it that I see. And then, because those representations match perfectly within the patriarchal society, they became the norm. But at the origin, they were made in, representation in like sexual setting, just as a way to make women feel uncomfortable, which they succeeded at. Loli has a complicated history now because, yes, it's very present in pornography, but it's also this idea of like the young, moe, cute, kawaii girl is also, just very popular now. And of course, you also have lesbian and queer creators in Japan who are also making, those kind of manga. And I don't want to make them totally disappear from the conversation.
That's part of the problem, isn't it, with a zero tolerance approach, is that you can't really draw those lines. And so one of the main risks, I guess, of a zero tolerance approach is that you mentioned in your paper is that violators can actually be reported to authorities, right, over this sort of content. So what consequences can platform users suffer if they're reported to authorities over animated content?
Well, like policy, of course, zero tolerance is both like a term that they use to, because the language that platform use in their policies reveal a lot the kind of moderation they want to perform for like a reader or like for online users. So to say zero tolerance, it's a very stern legal language when they're showing we have zero tolerance over it, we are in compliance with the authorities, we even collaborate with them. But it's also a legal reason, which is if they say they have a zero tolerance around it, it means that they can provide the authorities with all of the data they have about the user. It's like if you publish child pornography or like, child sexual abuse material on our website and we suspect it, or like we find you, we have a legal right to share your private information with the authorities because we've explicitly stated that we have zero tolerance around it. And the problem comes when it's animation or like cartoon, because they're going to use the same language and they're going to group animation with child sexual abuse materials, which I'm sure we all agree here should be reported, and it's very fair to have zero tolerance around it. But then for like animated pornographic media, it raises questions. And as we say, like, you can clearly see the limit, you see the risk for, for like left to the interpretation of a moderator to decide if it's good or not. If we go back to the Twitch example, during that one day when the policy was active, a lot of creators ended up being banned because they were being automatically flagged. So it's also when those platforms start to use automated tools to like find content, that don't provide a lot of nuance. Like what happened, because none of those contents can be trained with animation. So
I find it crazy to think that you could have someone posting a picture of a real child being abused, and then on the other hand, you could have someone posting a racy picture of like Summer from Rick and Morty, and they could get treated exactly the same. That just sounds insane to me.
Yeah, and I was talking with a content creator, like an adult content creators who use Patreon. So Patreon is actually interesting for adult content creators because their policies leaves a lot of room for animation and pornography. When they explicitly state like we do not want live action pornography, they do allow animation, cartoon, illustration. But I was talking to this creator who had his entire account deleted in one day without being able to negotiate because suddenly they decided he was doing bestiality or like it was incest or something. It's like, and he was like, I was not doing anything that I had not done before. But because, they're using those big terms, like it's very dangerous, it says bestiality, child sexual abuse materials, all of these are like, paraphilic sexualities that we have, a fair reason to believe should be banned and illegal. But for animation, he was doing like 3D monster porn.
Yeah, I've heard that Patreon treats monster porn as bestiality, and I believe that actually comes not from Patreon themselves, but from their payment processor, which enforces that rule. And of course, that throws up a whole lot of questions about furry fandom and their right to express themselves in visual form.
Yeah, and
Sorry, I feel like we're entering another spectrum of ambiguity. We've got the age spectrum of ambiguity, and then we've got the sentience spectrum of ambiguity, where you've got like animals on one side, human on the other, and then in the middle you've got like these anthropomorphized animals and bestial aliens and things. Where do you draw the line there if you're talking about bestiality?
Yeah, and that's the problem of, a platform. So that's also why I end up not even advocating for better tools, because I don't think the answer is there. The answer is not to have tools that are going to be more efficient at flagging, because it's a cultural problem.
Yeah, that is something else that you refer to in your paper about as more reliance is placed on AI for moderation. It's not going to solve the problems, right? It's just going to push them to a different level where we have to assess, are these tools going to do a better job at making the important differentiations between different sorts of content? Are they going to do a better job than humans?
Mm-hmm. Which even leave less room for negotiation. It's exactly what happened with Twitch, people who had hundreds of thousands of followers, and it's the same for the person I was talking to, the Patreon content creators. That's how he pays rent. And he lost his platform in one day.
And I feel like people are going to assume AI moderators are more objective when they're really not. Like I read an article the other day that an AI couldn't even tell that like a stick bug wasn't a stick, and it couldn't tell that it was an insect and not a stick, where like as humans clearly could. I mean, it's going to get better, but I think we've brought up before that AI has its own biases. Was it in your article that you mentioned that it has a harder time recognizing like dark faces over pale faces?
Yeah. But then if it doesn't work, if animation is always going to be wrongly flagged, or like this myth of efficiency of those AI automated detection tools doesn't exist anymore.
So just to change the topic slightly, I want to ask you about what we should be doing to reduce the harms of content that maybe people don't want to be exposed to, other than reporting them to authorities, which is clearly disproportionate and harmful in itself. What else can we do about people being exposed to content that they don't want to see?
Well, some things that really surprised me when I started to like think through this research is I went on Pornhub and I wrote lolicon, and then I got an automated pop-up that told me, if you're a pedophile and you need help, you can go on this website. And I felt like, I started to see the contour of the problem. I was like, me, I was doing it as a researcher, but I was like, if I am a consumer and I see this, my first answer is going to be, Pornhub doesn't know what's happening. They don't know what they're talking about. They don't understand that, like, I'm just looking for cartoons, I'm just looking for an image, and it's crazy. And like, I think I would feel very defensive. Yeah. And there's a very libertarian approach to, animation and anime porn that has always existed in the anime fandom community, because for a long time, pornographic animation was like unfairly targeted. And so people became very protective of it and very, it created a lot of discourse that were dismissive of concern over age and gender that we can legitimately have. Again, like, it's not saying let's ban all animated pornography if we just say it's kind of crazy that like all of those girls, you look so young. I think it's a conversation that can be nuanced and exist. So for me, it would be, first of all, for those platforms to start using those terms by fan, like shotacon, lolicon, and actually understand and define them, and being able to explain in their policies why they're using it and why this content is actually banned. Instead of just saying we ban all child pornography, parentheses, real, virtual, drawing, cartoons, is to say we ban all like child sexual abuse materials. Within those child sexual abuse materials, we include animation. Here's why. I think it would be a beginning of an answer.
I think you've acknowledged that there is a spectrum, right? There is definitely material that is perhaps AI generated, trained on real humans, and we don't want to see it. And then there's also really creative, artistic content that does reference characters who may be of indeterminate age, and the creators of that content may themselves be queer. They may have, legitimate artistic points to make, and yet it's all bundled together under the same category. Now, my fear is that if we do that, then people who have legitimate content are going to be forced to post that in dark spaces, in encrypted channels, maybe on the Tor network, places like that, where we also find real child sexual abuse material. So I feel like there has to be some middle ground where we can post content that fits within that part of the spectrum on the clear web, rather than pushing it into the dark web, which is only going to associate it more closely with real abuse content. What do you say to that? Is that how can we realize that kind of middle ground?
It's actually interesting because today I translated another article I wrote for Porn Studies called The Hentai Streaming Platform Wars, which I can send to you if you want after. So it means that I was reading it again today, and it's an article I published in December on, the ecosystem of pornographic animation online and all of those streaming platforms that exist, and a lot of them are totally black boxes. We don't know where they come from. We don't know who is running them. We don't know how exactly they make money, but they have a lot of content, and a lot of their content is, again, on the margin of legality, and probably illegal in a lot of countries. And I think a lot of this content exists on those platforms, on those like pirate, non-registered companies, that like have policies, but it's very much smokescreen. I think first we would need to have a pornographic platform that is dedicated to animation. And, like an actual one that exists, because then this kind of platform would allow for, much more nuance, because they would only be talking about animation. They would not have to even think about this question of like, but what do you do if it's a real child? What do like, I think it would solve a lot of problems.
So you close your paper by asking, what is the nature of the harm when no children were involved in its production? What is age if there is no body to pin it to? And you don't give a square answer to those questions, but how do you go about answering those questions, or how would you go about answering those questions?
What is age? What is consent? Well, I think it's an interesting question because it is open-ended. I kind of use this example of like, what is violence? What is age? What is consent? When you have no bodies to pin this to.
And as someone who consumes a lot of fantasy content, it muddies the water even more. Like, I was watching an anime the other day, and one of the characters looks like a child, and is often mistaken mistaken as a child by a lot of the other characters. But they're actually basically a hobbit. But they're like a middle-aged man with like a family of 3. But so it just made me start wondering, like, how would you classify like hentai if someone decided to make hentai of this character? He's got the maturity and the chronological age of like a 35-year-old, but he looks about 11.
So how much of this is about media criticism and like media education rather than making it about censorship as it is at present?
I think, someone like Zara Stardust, she's an Australian, like activist, like a tech writer and academics, of course. I remember she said this, and she said it in her recent book to Indie Porn, that we insist so much on telling people that porn is not real, especially like teenagers. But maybe we should start to tell people actually porn is real. It is an industry. And it's the same with like those representations. Like, instead of saying like, oh, but it's not real, is to say actually it is real. Like someone is making it. It's a question I used to tell my students in a class on like porno, because I was teaching animation and we had a week on pornography. And I was like, are those characters sex workers? And of course they were all saying, no, they're not. And I was like, okay, so where are the workers here? Where are the people? Like, what do we think is behind like this short animation? It means that someone made it. So there was maybe a voice actor involved, like to kind of make the industry apparent. I think it's part of education. And, once you start to think of the industry, you start to think also, about the political economy of it and the cultural economy, and like what are the politics of the creators, and what kind of content do you want to consume, and what kind of content do we want to distribute. And I think it's much more useful than just starting to say like censoring.
Are you saying that the thing we should use to judge a piece of content is the character of the creator who made it?
More like to understand the context of the production, because like if you are able to like understand that like the Bart Simpson, it's a parody, it's a commentary on like, how those comics are super family friendly. And they're actually not family friendly, but they're not supposed to be pornographic. It gives you some hints to understand them.
Yeah, I think framing these as problematic rather than as illegal, or even just not using terms that impute illegality when instead we should just be talking about them as being problematic, is a lot more helpful and really allows a lot more space for a conversation around these works rather than shutting down conversation as we otherwise would do by applying blanket categories of censorship to them.
Can I give an example that is maybe more related to the question of age? In my thesis right now, I'm looking at, there was this anime called Kites, and that was distributed in the US, in the 2000. But the first time it was like early 2000, the first time it was distributed, it was heavily edited. And some fans were mad because they were like, oh, they took off all of the pornography part of it. But, among those pornography part of it, that, the editors decided to take off during importation, they edited, they changed the dialogue, all of it. There was a lot of scenes of rape against a child. And it was animation, but like, and you kind of had a fan movement that started to organize to bring back the unedited version. And again, it was a very like libertarian attitude to it, and like super resistant to the idea of like any kind of editing being done. But then you put it in perspective and you're like, it was a very problematic media representation. Like, how do you think the younger woman in anime fandom felt to see like such a big uproar of a fan being like, it is actually super important for us to be able to see the rape of this child, of this, like, of course, fictional child, but still. And I'm like taking this in perspective and just thinking, like, from a community, what does it mean? Sometimes it's more important than, like, again, being super fixated on, like, should you do it, should you not do it? Because you look at those statements and it's about creative freedom, of course, super important, but sometimes it's like, let's take a step back and actually wonder, what are we fighting for? And like, again, like, how does it make other people feel when we do this?
So you've mentioned your PhD research. Is there anything else in your research that you're planning to publish articles about, or is there any other research that is on the horizon for you?
So we have an article under review with a professor at Université de Laval, which is in Quebec. It's going to be in French, but maybe we would work a translation. And it's about representation of sexuality in animation by women independent directors. I'm also working on a project. I'm doing an internship right now at the Canada chair of the digital regulation at work and life. And we are working on a project on how in policies, people who make AI are put at the same level as people who make creative porn. It's like there's a lot of conflation between, like, AI, people who create AI porn, but then it's the same as, like, creative porn workers.
I feel like, yeah, AI is going to be a big fly in the ointment because we've got live action and then we've got animated, but then AI is going to create this whole other subgenre of things that look live animated but don't actually involve people, which I think are going to have their own completely individual set of rules.
Yeah, I mean, one of the problems is that if there's only two categories, which is real or fictional, then AI is always going to be the thin end of the wedge to regulate all fictional media. And so I think there is some merit in saying maybe there should be a third category of content in the way that we regulate it. And that is going to be incredibly contentious because, as you may know, just in the last few days, the US has put a moratorium on new state-level regulation of AI. So we are kind of stuck in an unregulated state for a while.
No, that's why we should, like, my advice for moderators, if this is like the last part where I can give the advice, is look at how do communities who have always dealt with those questions, have been dealing with them, actually get interested in this history of the moderation of non-realistic content. Because animation has always existed and animation has always been regulated. Look what worked, look what didn't work. Talk to those people who are fans and who actually, will be the consumer base impacted. And get curious. That's why I'm kind of defending also, like, using term like lolicon, which actually talk to this community. Like, they understand what you mean.
Thank you very much for coming and talking to us. It's been really illuminating and interesting. So congratulations again on the publication of your article and for your future research. So any final remarks you'd like to leave us with?
No, I mean, thank you for the invitation. And, again, like, I hope people are going to be able to get interested in those topics and, work on providing always better and more inclusive moderation practices.
I think we can all agree on that. So thanks once again for coming in and talking to us. And we hope listeners will tune in again next month for another episode of Beyond the Filter.